Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for checking out this presentation today. April 4th to April 10th is National Library Week. And to celebrate, we are welcoming Nutley Museum Director John Simko.
Hey, everybody.
John will discuss Nutley Amateur Circus from 1894. It's an event which brought the whole town together. This is John's third online discussion for us, and we are very grateful to him for doing these programs for us and all the work that he puts into them for us. John has also discussed, they're available on YouTube, Nutley murals and Nutley muralists. He discussed that back in February. And this past December, he gave a virtual tour of the Nutley Museum. And I learned more about Guthrie's. I never knew about Guthrie's before. I learned so many different things throughout that discussion. Both of these programs, they can be found right on our YouTube page. And now I'm just going to turn over the presentation to John. Thank you, John.
You're very welcome. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the circus that inspired a town. And just something about the event in general. So this Nutley Amateur Circus, which is 1894, was first and foremost a charitable event. And it was put together, as the name implies, by amateurs in Nutley for the most part. And it was something that the whole town really enthusiastically embraced. I think with all of the different groups that I'm involved with in town, that spirit is certainly still alive in Nutley today. And so this talk is really dedicated, I think, to all those Nutley volunteers who give their time, give their efforts, not just for history, but the volunteer ambulance and just everybody who volunteers their time and efforts for the community. This 1894 event is a beautiful example of that feeling, but I find that feeling is still very much alive in town. So with that, I like to start my talks off with this little quote. This is actually the dedication from Elizabeth Brown's 1907 History of Nutley, dedicated to the people of the town of Nutley. This could easily, I think, be applied to a lot of organizations in town, certainly to the Nutley Historical Society and the Preservation Committee, both of which I'm happy to be a part of. So today, again, the talk is about the Nutley Amateur Circus. Here is a top spread for one of the local papers. You'll notice on the bottom here, Dalrymple. We're going to find that a lot of the illustrations that were done to promote this were done by very high-end artists, mostly from Puck magazine in New York City. They all being friends of Henry Bunner, who you're going to meet soon if you don't know him already. Here's a flyer that went out. So March 27th, it was a Tuesday, 1894. You'll notice some of the names that are listed. H.C. Bunner's name. Now, when I put my cursor here, Nick, are people seeing that?
Yes, they are.
Okay, so you see the Bunner name here. James Bailey, who wound up being the director of the circus. We're going to meet him in a minute. And people here like Mr. Guy A. Ward or Wilkie Satterthwaite. These are people who are electricians, plumbers, farmers, people who are learning circus tricks for this museum, for this circus event. Here is a second one. You see it was owned by a Rutan, the Nutley Amateur Circus, March 27th, and you can see the name above managers right here, a little bit better than the previous one, George H. Bain and F.E. Butler. F.E. Butler, of course, is Frank Butler, who some of us might think of him as Mr. Annie Oakley. That's Annie Oakley's husband, who not only was her manager, but stepped forward to manage and promote this circus as well. George Bain is one of the founders of this event. And one of the last connections to this is a building that Mr. Bain lived in at the time. Some of you know or knew the resident who lived there 2 owners later, which is Ruth Bedford. So George Bain's house was associated with the circus. It was associated with Annie Oakley going there to plan this all out, even before the Longfelders owned it, and Annie became a regular visitor there. I'm going to show you a picture of that house in a little bit. But George Bain, again, who is a New York lawyer, but living on Highfield Avenue in Nutley, when there were only 2 buildings, by the way, on Highfield Lane at that point. Focus in a little closer here. Nutley Amateur Circus, you see that there is an afternoon and an evening performance. The afternoon was for children. And the way that was promoted was that it was for children under the age of 15 and their legitimate nurses if they had them. There was no big sisters, Henry Bunner said, that could get involved with this. So it was strictly children under the age of 15, paid a quarter for the event. Again, this is a charity event. You're going to find out that even the performers themselves had to pay the entry fee for this. It was all in great fun and all to raise money to start a Red Cross chapter in Nutley. This is probably the best image, I think, that promotes what the event really was like. This was done, you can see the name here, by Peter Newell in 1894. This was in Harper's Weekly magazine. Peter Newell is a Nutley artist. We're going to see some of his work later on, but I just want to focus in on this to show you the tumbling that went on. This is an era in Nutley and throughout that's all about the horse. So we're going to meet a lot of horse people. We're going to meet people who do horse tricks, including this dog, Simko, that you see sitting right here. In the center here, we'll focus more on this later, but is Annie Oakley standing on the bareback of a speeding horse shooting glass balls. So we will discuss that in detail. Here is one of our local artists, Edward Lloyd Field. We've got some oil paintings of his that are very beautiful in our museum. Well, that day he put on a performance as an animal trainer and came out and did a very comedic performance. You see our two clowns are standing on pylons with the indication of the Red Cross there to again let you know what this event is. You even see Eaton Stone's barn, where this event took place, is decorated with crosses, presumably red, for the event. We'll talk more about that barn in a couple of minutes. And here is Henry Bunner, H.C. Bunner, who was recently, in 2017 actually, elected to the Nutley Hall of Fame as an editor, author, poet, sort of all-around good guy who lived in Nutley for about the last 10 or 11 years of his life. And while Annie Oakley was the kind of ringer for this event and got everyone's interest, it was Henry Bunner's New York connections as a journalist and a press agent that really got the New York papers. The New York Times covered this. All of the New York papers and big magazines across the country covered this event, certainly with Annie Oakley, but because of their connections with H.C. Bunner. And we're going to see that a lot of people give him credit for this charitable event. And here he is simply acting, as you can see down below, as press agent. He's not a press agent in his professional life, but again, everyone took on an amateur role for this event. So I just want to introduce the three principal people that I'm going to be discussing initially, and one is Henry Cuyler Bunner, H.C. Bunner. Annie Oakley, of course, was our ringer, and this is a photograph of Annie soon after she came back from her 5-year European tour, where she got all of these medals. And this is the Annie Oakley that would have been performing a year or two later in 1894. I think she came back in 1892, 1894 at our event. Eaton Stone was a bareback performer, one of the devil riders who would ride so fast he would put fear into everybody in the tents. Circus performer, a guy who runs away at the age of 10 to go join the circus. His father brings him back. He leaves again at age 12, and finally he stays with the circus through his whole life. He retires a rich man in Nutley in about 1850 or so, buys 40 acres of property just to farm on what became Roche property later and now the ON3 property. It was in Eaton's circus tent or practice pavilion. People describe it different ways. You're going to see some images of it. No photographs exist, but some drawings and etchings of it, where people used to winter their horses, or riders would come and train here for performances in New York City. It's thought Annie Oakley had visited Eaton Stone. That was one of the ways that she knew about Nutley before she moved here. So Eaton Stone comes out of retirement 40 years after he retires to do one of his great bareback tricks that night, and this is the older Eaton. So we're going to talk more about him in a minute. So Bunner, Oakley, and Eaton Stone are the three real principals of this, and I want to get into their stories in a little bit more detail. Henry Cuyler Bunner, you see him here as a young man. He was a a journalist in New York, first a banker and then left that, became a journalist, left that, and hooked up as editor of, and you can see a very young man, I think he was 19 years old, when he becomes the editor of Puck magazine. Puck magazine, some of you may recognize, here is the building on Houston Street when it first went up in the 1890s. Here is a picture of it today. It's still there going strong. If you go back to this picture, you see the sculpture, the statue of Puck, who is a figure from Midsummer Night's Dream, a Shakespeare play, and he becomes the symbol of that politically satirical magazine. When it first starts, by the way, Puck magazine is in German in 1892, I believe. And within a year or two, it becomes German and English, and then it becomes totally an English publication. That's when they get H.C. Bunner on, and he makes it one of the most successful weekly magazines in the United States. And its big thing, and you can see from the sculpture here, a close-up of Puck, what Puck's tools were a mirror to hold up to yourself, to hold up to society, to see what we really are, and then a pen to write about it. Of course, these are things that Puck in the original Shakespeare play didn't have, but Bunner's does, this sort of fat cherub with a top hat, a kind of 1890s dandy, but looking at society and giving what it thinks is a very honest, if harsh, appraisal, mostly of politicians and corruption. They stay in business, by the way. Henry dies, unfortunately, at age 41 in 1896, a couple of years of tuberculosis, a couple of years after the circus. But the magazine goes on until 1917. Last couple of years of their life, they had focused their attention on people like William Randolph Hearst, exposing his corruption to the country. And the only way that he really won that battle was to purchase Puck magazine and shut it down in 1917. But prior to that, it was the big satirical political magazine in the country, and all the credit is given to the editorial skills of H.C. Bunner. Here is a typical lithograph. They also became very famous and popular because they were the first to have these, they had large lithograph machines which produced these color illustrations in the basement of that building, of this building here, the largest set of lithographic machines in the world. So they turned out magazines that beat everybody else, not just for the political satire, but for their design and for their color at all. This you see, you may not be able to read, but this figure here is holding a stick or a wedge that's called education. And you can see that the divine rights, all of these different potentates from around the world, are being put off of the cliff by human rights through the concept of education. So this is a typical thing that Puck magazine would attack. Here we see billion-dollar bank merger. This is J.P. Morgan, who's grabbing all of those banks downtown. You see this hand here is even reaching out to the piggy bank that this little boy is holding on to. So again, the satire, the biting satire of Puck magazine. Here is the Senate with the latest thing in nightmares, this is called. And you can see the caricature here of Teddy Roosevelt, who's really putting attention and a spotlight on the Senate. But there's also a very funny and prescient side to some of the things that H.C. Bunner does. We all know emoji art. Well, here's the beginnings of it, called typographical art. This is from an 1890s publication of Puck magazine, where they use different punctuation to express joy, melancholy, indifference, astonishment. So the precursors to today's emojis come out of Puck magazine. This was a particularly, just a fantastic article, an illustration that accompanied an article about the craze of all of these newspapers having to be the first with their news. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? If I were to blow up this little group here, fake news. This could have been something that was written last year, 4 years ago, 5 years ago. Humbug news, cheap sensation, but the recognition of fake news being shoved in your face, again, comes from Puck magazine. So that is the considered the genius of Henry Bunner, and this is how he had all of those great New York connections to make our amateur circus to make all the New York people who came in droves, by the way, that night to witness the event as well, as we're going to learn. This was his connection, was through this magazine. But he's also an author, not just an editor. Here is Bunner as author. His first novel is called The Midge, and he becomes fairly famous as an author for that. But he really reaches the high point of his art as a short storyteller. So there are books like Love in Old Clothes, one that is close to us here, Jersey Street and Jersey Lane. And these were all filled with really great short stories about his personal life. Jersey Street, by the way, is one of the streets that runs right below the Puck building that I showed you earlier. It's still there, downtown Manhattan. And he would basically go in, sit by his window, and look at basically the immigrants that were working all around that neighborhood, and write about them. And so Jersey Lane, of course, is a reference to the suburbs, to Nutley, and he gets right to it in this book called The Suburban Sage, which I think he fancied himself as, and he certainly took a lot of good, all in good fun ribbing from his urban counterparts when he decided to give up the New York apartment and move out here to Nutley, this place for sale cheap. So The Suburban Sage is Henry Bunner. As I say, he lived here for the last 11 years or so of his life. All of these books, he's a loving husband, loving father. He loved the town of Nutley. They're all dedicated to ALB, who was Alice Learned Bunner, his wife, who winds up selling the house and leaving Nutley within a couple of weeks of his untimely death, and they returned back to New London, where her family still lives to this day. One of their relatives came down for the ceremonies when Bunner was inducted into the Nutley Hall of Fame. Here is a drawing of Alice, and I wanted to show this to you. This was something, and I've got to give a shout out to town historian John Demmer, who had purchased a book of Bunner's, and inside of it found a couple of drawings that the best we could make out were done by Ralph Bunner, his brother, who was an artist in his own right, a painter and a sketcher. This is Alice, and this is this wonderful caricature of H.C. Bunner himself in a really sort of fun mood. But wait, that's not all. He also wrote a couple of pieces of music and librettos. Here's a very bad quality photo of one called Three Operettas by H.C. Bunner. Bunner lived, by the way, you see his property here. Here is Whitford Avenue, here is Grant, and here's Nutley, which means that a block off in this direction to the Whitford side of this, where the Ray house is. Another block away is where he would have caught the train to go into New York City to do his work as editor. So that is the Bunner neighborhood. You can see what a beautiful large piece of property he does have here. I want to mention his love for gardens as well. He talks about the gardens that he began to cultivate here, and talks about every different plant that he would have in there, and likens the garden to almost your first stab, he would say, at having children and raising children. He was very proud of his gardens, and I could only wish that he could have taken a couple of walks to go see Silas Monsieur's gardens these days. Bunner would have absolutely loved them. But he had what was called the Bunner Farm, very big piece of property. I think there are 3 houses now. Bunner's home is no longer there on this piece of property on Whitford and Chestnut. By the way, some of you might have spotted here the Episcopal Church, Grace Church, this is a small wooden building before it moved to Highfield Lane to where it is today. Here is a picture of the Nutley that Bunner and all these other people would have been living in when the circus was given. I mentioned to you a block away was the Nutley train station, one of 3 stations in town. This is the one that's in the Nutley region, where all basically the artists and the lawyers, John Bouvier, they would all get on this train and go into New York City. Here is the Nutley Fieldhouse, a block away, actually just behind this here, and Bunner was one of the founding members. He gave up his social clubs in New York City, but became involved in some of the social clubs in Nutley as well. And again, you see the horse and carriage here. This is what Nutley was like. I want to introduce you to one character to introduce a great photo that I've got of Bunner. So the guy who took care of this train station, who is not only a friend of Bunner's, but his name is John Donaldson, and he is credited, one of the stories is he's credited with having Annie Oakley move here. One of the stories is Annie got on a train with her husband to come visit Eaton Stone and got off at the wrong station in town. This individual here, John Donaldson, was waiting at the station as was his job, befriended them, took them on his carriage and brought them over to Eaton Stone's, showing Nutley off on the way there. And the idea is that they loved it for a number of other reasons. They were looking for a place to live that was within commute of New York City, and they wound up choosing Nutley. So not only was Bunner, as I said, and this picture that we have shows what a friend he was to Annie Oakley. This is a card that she sent to him where she shot the hole through, but I came across this photograph and just have a bad Xerox of it in an article that I read a couple of years ago, and it shows Bunner in that property that I showed you on Whitford raising a pig. He loved to, when he really became the Suburban Sage, and raised donkeys. He would write comically about giving vaccinations to pigs. And that he was going to buy a donkey shortly. And you can see this figure in the back with his cap and with that mustache and that badge has got to be our friend John Donaldson, just sort of shooting the breeze with bespeckled, hatted, probably in his tweed suit, Henry Bunner in the backyard on off of Whitford Avenue. When he finally did get that donkey, he didn't know what to do with it. And it is a bunch of famous stories in town about the braying that this did. And eventually he had to sell it and get rid of it. So one other follow-up with Bunner. So Bunner is famous, I had mentioned, as a short story writer, as a novelist, but also as a poet. And his best poem, or most well-known, is something called The Way to Arcady. But the one that I want to mention here is called The Heart of a Tree. And it's a poem that he writes about what does he plant when he plants a tree. He talks about he plants the glory of the plain, he plants the forest's heritage, the harvest of a coming age, the joy that unborn eyes shall see. These things he plants who plants a tree. And he goes on with a bunch of different verses about what a tree means, the heart of the tree. Well, what I find out is that an episode of Leave It to Beaver, if you're my age, you remember this show, but I think everybody's heard of Leave It to Beaver. There's actually an episode written around that poem. Beaver's class is given the assignment of memorizing that poem, and they give very dry renditions, robotic of it. Well, their teacher recites it to them the next day in the passionate way that it was meant to be recited. And Beaver is so inspired by this. He has a memory of his youth, of his dad giving him a tree that he planted in the yard of a home they no longer live in town. So what does Beaver do? He gets his friend and their wagon. They go to this other house that somebody else now owns, and they dig up this tree, put it in the wagon, and take it home. Don't you know that the owner of this house is named Mr. Benner? Benner, not Mr. Bunner. And of course, everything comes out very nicely at the end. He allows them to keep the tree. This poem inspires Beaver and his friends to what this concept of a tree and doing things for your town in the future means. So it was really wild to stumble across that while doing some research on Bunner. Another thing that I will just go through quickly because it's a little bit crazy is this image. As I'm looking at the stills from the episode, I see a picture here that I think that's got to be painted by one of our Nutley artists, Edward Loyal Field. We have this one in our museum, and just as a fun thing, I thought I would throw this in there. I'm not saying it's an Edward Loyal Field, but since the episode was about a Nutley, I just wanted to point that out. So that's Henry Bunner. The next figure, of course, is Annie Oakley. This is a photograph of Annie when she's quite young, before she's covered herself in all of those medals. Here is husband Frank Butler. And again, while Annie lived in our town, she was Mrs. Frank Butler to everyone. She was not the superstar Annie Oakley, although we all knew she was. And in fact, when she met Frank, she was not the superstar. Frank was. Here is Frank doing shooting tricks like shooting glass balls in the air, doing some very contorted shots. Annie was known to put 3 shotguns on a table. They would send 3 clay pigeons up. She would leap over a table, get to that table, pick up each shotgun and do it. So there was a lot of acrobatics involved, not just the accuracy of shooting. And Frank was first and foremost with that. But as you can see here, I took some of those from details from this poster. This poster is Graham and Butler. Butler, of course, being Frank Butler, and we can see that everybody who's seen Annie Got Your Gun knew that he made the mistake or the great choice of challenging 15-year-old Annie Oakley to a shooting match, and the rest is history. So now the posters are about Annie Oakley, and Frank becomes her manager and steps away really from the performance end of it. If you take a look, my next photo is going to be this vignette. So these are all the different things that Annie would do. In this poster, by the way, this poster was a gift to our museum back in 1948 by Annie Oakley's niece. If I were to blow up that vignette, you can see that it mentions a feature of Nutley, New Jersey, the Amateur Circus, March of '94. This makes it look like it's taking place in some huge outdoor arena. You're going to see the rather small 600-seat pavilion that it took place in, but artistic license is taking its place here. Note the horse Molly with the spots. I'm going to talk about her in a couple of minutes. Annie, of course, had her home built, she and Frank, on Grant Avenue, and I think it was there until the 30s or the 40s when it came down. I had mentioned to you now that this is the Annie who comes back from her stint 5 years in Europe, performing in front of all the crown heads of Europe, Queen Victoria, the President of France, all of these different people, getting all of these medals, challenging them or being challenged by them to shooting matches, beating everyone. So this is the Annie who comes back to Nutley and performs at our local circus. All of you know Annie in our post office. Here are just a couple of other images of Annie doing her tricks for Buffalo Bill's Wild West. This is Annie in a sketch a day or two before she performed at our circus, practicing around the grounds of Eaton Stone. Now, Buffalo Bill, I'll just mention him because Annie, again, had just come off of a stint of working, being the star of the Buffalo Bill's Rough Riders throughout Europe for the 5 years prior. But the idea was that when they came back, Buffalo Bill was going to open a semi-permanent, a number of years, 5 years, Buffalo Bill's Wild West. First he was at Madison Square Garden, but this was going to be in South Brooklyn. And that was one of the reasons why Annie felt it wasn't a bad idea to get a house in Nutley. All those other people are getting on trains and ferries to get into New York to go do their work. She would do the same. So this is one of the incentives for Annie coming here. Here's just a poster of Buffalo Bill at Madison Square Garden. So he's not only out in the West. Here is our girl Annie, the Peerless Lady Wingshot, as part of the Congress of Rough Riders of the world. So the Rough Riders were Buffalo Bill's Wild West group, and they consisted of all of these different horsemen and horsewomen from around the world. By the way, Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders took their name from this group. Here you see Cossacks from the Caucasus, Indians on their pinto ponies, Arabs of the desert riding their steeds. Up here you see Miss Annie Oakley, the Peerless Lady Wingshot, who takes her place among all of these Rough Riders. So Buffalo Bill, it was not very pleasant what they did at these sometimes, certainly not for that bear. They would reproduce what today are certainly politically incorrect stage shows about what the Wild West was like. And this was at a time, by the way, that even though this seems so far back to us, at a time when the Wild West was disappearing, Mark Twain would go to these and would write about how this is the last chance you're going to get to see this stuff. So it wasn't showing things that were really happening contemporaneously, but it even was looking back in the past. Here we see Annie Oakley, who you can see, unlike her male counterparts, is sitting side saddle like a proper lady on the horse. And here she ends her performance by giving a handshake to Buffalo Bill. So back to Annie Oakley. I show you this because it mentions that she's part of the Wild West exhibition, but it also shows that this was published in London. This was published when she was in London, meeting for the king and queen. She's not only great on horses, but she also does advertising and tricks on bicycles as well. So back to the young Annie Oakley here, and here's a picture. We're going to talk about Dave, this dog, a little bit later, but here is an older photo of Annie, whose hair is has turned white. At least the apocryphal story is from the last train accident and the shock of that she and her husband were in. They both, by the way, died in 1926, only about 2 weeks or so apart. But on to happier times with this. This is Eaton Stone. I showed you the picture of the old Eaton Stone earlier. This is Eaton Stone as the Devil Rider. This is Eaton Stone, I had mentioned to you, born in Bennington, Vermont. 10 years old, runs away to join a traveling ventriloquist. His father, who's a lawyer, has to sue this guy to get his son back. 2 years later, he takes off. The father gets him back again. Another year later, he leaves and brings his younger brother, Dennison, who becomes a successful clown in the circuses. And they both leave and they go on to their incredibly successful careers. Eaton Stone, he would put on he was called the Indian Rider, and he would put on all of these shows about the Wild West. He purported to be kidnapped by Comanche Indians as a young man, and that he learned all of his riding tricks from them until he grabbed their fastest horse and hightailed it out of there and came back to the east and began to show tricks that he said no white man knew because these Indians showed it to him. So he's credited with changing rather passive scenes that people would see of the Wild West into these, and he was again known as the fastest, most fearless rider, and he would get up on the back of a horse like this while it was riding at breakneck speeds and do somersaults in the air and land on these speeding horses. And he, as a matter of fact, you can see Drury Lane Theater here, he goes to Europe before Annie does, a couple of years even before Buffalo Bill, and sells out the Drury Lane Theater, one of the big theaters in London, and travels throughout England, again, performing for all of the crowned heads. So he is somebody who was up on that level of a performer as Buffalo Bill and Annie Oakley. He is successful enough that at about the age of 40, he retires, buys a 40-acre farm, as what I've mentioned to you became the Roche property. He says his success, by the way, financial, was that he invested in properties and never invested in a circus, where he made his living all of his life. He claims that Cornelius Vanderbilt took care of his monies until he died, and then his son took care of his monies. He was close enough with Vanderbilt that he had Vanderbilt build a little spur of the railroad onto his property after he discovered a brownstone quarry, again on the Roche property, and wound up supplementing his income by selling brownstone as well. That little railroad spur and his friendship with Vanderbilt also got the railroad to agree to have a couple of special trains come in from New York and Newark the day of that performance to bring people to within 50 yards of the circus tent. So this is the home that Eaton lived in. This survived through the Roche ownership. I think it came down maybe in 1948. This is where a number of managers or one of the head managers and his family lived while they managed some things at Roche. This was one of the homes that was given over to their executives. To let you know where this is the railroad. If you were on near Nichols Pond, this is where Nichols Pond is, up by Bloomfield Avenue. You can see the home that I pointed out is right here, but if you look up here, you see Brownstone Quarry, Eaton Stone's property, but you see this hexagonal footprint here. This is the Circus Pavilion, the circus tent. I'll show you a bit more of a close-up of it, and maybe this later map will put it in in perspective. Again, here is the railroad. Let me back up right here to show you that little railroad spur that came through Eaton Stone's property right into here. So this was initially to take out brownstone, but then it was also used to get people in there that day of the circus. So here you can see the Circus Pavilion here as well. And again, think of it more as a horse training pavilion. Today, my understanding is that this building, this is right off of Kingsland Road, is about on the site where that the pavilion would have been. Eaton was not only a circus performer, he was an artist as well. Here is Eaton's own oil painting. This is in our museum of what his museum, at least in his mind's eye, looked at. You can see the horse up on the top. Eaton Stone, he was called the Devil Rider. He was called all sorts of great names. He simply calls himself Eaton Stone, the Wonder. So this is the pavilion. Here are a couple of close-ups of this. It's really this wonderful little painting here. Again, this is all about the horse. So some of the flag in there, some of the finials on top of the tent are these horse heads. Eaton not only painted that, but we've got a glass of a goblet that he hand painted and decorated in his house as well. So he's a very artistic guy, very expressive guy. The Nutley Historical Society back in 1948, and I think that's when this building eventually came down, and this is the Simpson afterwards in the Eaton Stone property, held a dinner, not there, but used that as the image for the Nutley Historical Society. I show you that because I want to show you the menu, which had Kingsland grapefruit, John Mason, you all know the Mason House cranberry sauce, Annie Oakley salad, Eaton Stone cake, Van Riper peas. So they would do this each year, and this one, at least the image, was the Eaton Stone house featuring for dessert the Eaton Stone cake. Here is Eaton as a retired young man. It's only 1890, I mean retired older man. It's 1891. He is not dead yet, but this is an article just about the famous Eaton Stone. And again, I want to show you what Eaton was like that night. He even performed a trick that night, but this is him the night of the 1894 circus when he came out of retirement after 40 years to do a trick for his friends. Eaton is the only one of these three who still resides in Nutley, and he is in the Methodist cemetery with this very simple stone. A couple of quick pictures of the Nutley of that era. Some of you can picture, can see Town Hall here and the library, not the library, it was First Bank of Nutley, it's now the optometrist, but you see the horse and carriages along Chestnut. Here is another picture of basically what Nutley looked like. It's all about the horse and about the farms. Here is, I think, opening day of school at Yanakaw. One of the families, and I'm going to introduce you to Alan Sterrett, but who had a role in the circus, were the Sterretts. The Sterretts were 3 generations worth of taking care of the horse needs of Nutley. Joseph Sterrett is the middle. His father was the Sterrett who comes from Scotland and opened up the livery and the boarding stable, which was on Chestnut Street. And Joseph's son, Alan, was a 14-year-old boy who performed at the circus that night. We're going to meet Alan and hear his story in a moment. Here is the Sterrett's stable, where they, again, would paint carriages, fix wheels, do everything related to, and this is on Chestnut Street, to carriages. By the way, right here, you can see a side view of the Vreeland House to give you an idea, or the Women's Club, to give you an idea of where this is. They're all things horses. They even made, one of the Sterretts made this beautiful papier-mâché horse that we have displayed in the museum, a really beautiful little piece. So, Nutley Amateur Circus. Let's get right to that. There was actually a publication that the town put out for a couple of lucky people to get. I've only seen this one that we've got in the museum. Nutley Amateur Circus. You see the Red Cross. And by the way, this was to start what was called a lending sort of a lending library for the sick and the hurt. What it really tried to do was not necessarily start a Red Cross chapter, but under the auspices of the Red Cross, they were going to try to buy medicines. They were going to try to buy splints and plaster to make casts for people. We didn't really have that as a town. You'd have to go into Newark. And in fact, one of the things that they did was they wanted to endow a bed in Newark for somebody in Nutley, a Nutleyite, or as they also said, or a stranger who's within our gates, if they needed a hospital bed. So we're very primitive at this point, 1894, in terms of taking care of people who have an accident and break their leg or who get sick. And this was the first attempt to do that. The idea was, one of the better stories is that Henry Bunner, who the last couple of years of his life, who was dying of tuberculosis basically, was one of the few men who didn't go into work and kind of was around town. So he's a very charitable guy, and he's got a lot of money because of his success. And he tells the local doctor, gives him money to take care of sick people in Nutley. Don't tell them, but here's money to cover their bills. So when the idea came up to make that something more permanent, to make it this charitable event that gets a permanent lending hospital, Henry was very much behind it. So that's why you see the Red Cross here. A lot of local artists. So the whole idea of the amateur thing is that Nutleyites trained to ride horses. Ushers were Nutley. Wall Street brokers would act as Nutleys, and the famous line, or the funniest line that I read across was, and lawyers would act as clowns. Sometimes they do even outside of the circus, but they certainly volunteered to do that for the event. But even our artists contributed. So here is an etching done by Arthur Hober. Arthur Hober is a very famous artist, and he's certainly one of Nutley's well-loved. This is a painting that he has got in our library. Anne Troy considered this one of the three beautiful works of art that were on public view for Nutleyites. Go see this in your local library. It's been hanging there since 1915. Arthur Hober contributed to the amateur circus as well. Edward Loyal Field here, the guy that I told you that acted as a animal trainer. Maybe that's why he put these little etchings in here. But this is on the back of that pamphlet, and this shows you his take on what that, a rather artistic view, I think, of what that circus tent looked like. And remember, he is the painter who I showed you the painting that looked like the thing hanging on Beaver's room in Leave It to Beaver. Here are the only 4 images that I've come across of that circus tent. I think this is probably the most realistic, and it was built in 1874, 20 years prior to our circus, again as a training pavilion. My understanding is that it was quite run down by 1894, and that was the first time that the citizens, neighbors got together, painted it, actually constructed 600 seats inside for people to come in and watch the event. And for the first time, strung lights from the Nichols factory across the way by Nichols Pond, and that waterfall there was used to generate electricity. And they tapped into that and actually strung lights. Here is the tent as well. You can see the Red Cross on it. This looks a little bit closer to the artistic view. Maybe it's more out of the fields of France that Edward Loyal Field, who does some of his great work in France, shows as well. And then, of course, back to Eaton's own rendition of it. So that's the building where this takes place. This article, Illustrated American, a very big magazine at the time, again covered the event, which was March 27th, 1894. This is out a couple of days later. And amateur circus folks rehearsing. And so this is, again, letting us all know that this is not just a circus that's put on by people who are skilled in the art. This was Nutleyites who, and you can see this guy most likely fell off the horse and hurt his back because they went through months and months of training. So I just want to go back and show you this list of regular Nutley names: Guy Ward, Wilkie Satterthwaite, Henry Bunner, James Bailey, who was the worked in New York City but lived in Nutley. He was the director of the Railroad Gazette magazine. We're going to see a picture of him in a moment. And by the way, I go back to this and I show you the George H. Bain name. And this is Ruth Bedford's house originally, before it got the work done on it after the Longfelders purchased it. This house is now in new hands, and it's being lovingly cared for and renovated as we speak. Again, this is one of the few connections that we really do have to this circus and to Annie Oakley. This is where Bain would have had people come together to plan for that circus, and this building is still here. This building is on the Nutley landmark list put together by the Preservation Committee. So off to a rehearsal. This is just a sketch of people going to the circus tent to learn their tricks. We'll see some of them practicing in a bit. This is Bailey, the guy who I mentioned is the editor of the Railroad Gazette, a big magazine throughout the country, who is practicing to be the ringmaster that night. They were generous in what nice shape they put him in. This is a little bit closer to what Mr. Bailey looked like. This is actually a photograph of him in all of his glorious girth. This is a nice photo because it shows the inside of the barn. We don't have any photographs, I mentioned, of the outside, but this shows you the makeshift, very simple benches that were constructed in a circle to fit 600 people at the event. This is a photographer came up the day before the event and took some of these photos that you are going to see today. So after Professor Robinson's cornet band, and he's somebody who had worked for Barnum and Bailey Circus for many, many years. Again, all of these people are friends of Eaton Stone's and are making their appearance here because of their friendship with him. Let me just open something up here. So I just show you that group of names again, but that the overture, and this, by the way, is a 25-piece band that comes out and really rocks the house. Here is a set of drawings of some of the people who performed that night. So again, we know our ringer, Miss Annie Oakley, here and here, but what you're going to find out is that Annie did a trick that she never did before. So like an amateur, she had to practice for a new trick to present that night. We're going to talk about that in a moment. Here is Guy Ashbridge Ward. You saw his name, Guy Ward, right here, Mr. and Mrs. Guy Ward, and they wind up leading out 8 Nutley riders who do tricks, and 8 riders inside of the small pavilion. They really had their work cut out for them. So S. Marsh Young is another local, I believe he's a lawyer who learned how to do certain kind of horse tricks. We're going to see a little bit of that. Here is an example of one of the Nutleyites who is, again, very tentatively practicing on how to stand up on a horse, not even moving yet. So a lot of bumps and bruises. They trained a lot with mechanical devices that would hold them on the horse, but these were taken away certainly the day of the event. Here is Marsh Young doing some tricks with his own horse and another. A couple of close-ups of Mr. and Mrs. Ward. Here is Mrs. Ward on her horse. And again, side saddle, like any proper lady at the time. Here is a close-up of Marsh Young. Here are, again, some photos taken inside of the training tent. I will point out this one, which is this guy whose name is Charles Smith. He is an electrician who is learning how to do tumbling things off of a barebacked horse, and we're going to learn a little bit more about that horse. But again, electricians, plumbers, lawyers, doctors, people who had nothing to do except everybody certainly knows how to ride a horse, but people learning how to do tumbling tricks, acrobatic tricks on or off of horses, all to get monies together for this event. So bareback riding by Mr. A.G. Badger. A.G. Badger is one of the locals. Here again, he is practicing. Here he is learning how to again slide off of the back of this poor horse who turns up in everybody's photo. They had said that it really was a circus about fun and then charity, and this just shows you again what all of these different clowns performers would do for their fellow Nutleyites to sort of make money. This is a great little illustration of tumblers. Certainly means the people that would do things like this, but certainly our Nutleyites knew both of the definitions, and here they are enjoying a tumbler of a nice beverage, maybe to get ready for their next trick. There were a couple of professionals that did come in. You see Fred Runnels here. He was a professional clown. And you see these tumbling groups, acrobatics from the Orange Athletic Club, which is out of Newark, and the New York Athletic Club, the most famous one in the United States, lend some of their people to not only train our amateurs, but to do some tricks itself. This one here that shows, well, so there were these Roman ladder acts, which takes too much to explain, but it's basically people holding up ladders next to each other while other people are climbing those ladders, doing these great acrobatic tricks. So that was that. But you see down below that scientific boxing by Professor Donovan and Alpheus Gear, who is a local Nutleyite. But Professor Donovan, I read about him. He's this guy, but he's also this guy. And he's the guy who basically invents the sweet science of boxing. Prior to this book coming out, boxing was a rough and tumble event. Get in the ring and try to beat the stuffings out of your partner. This is a book that is filled with illustrations, as you can see, even the indication around here of the foot skills that it would take to get yourself in the position to land a blow or to duck a blow. So Professor Donovan, who is at least nationally famous as the author of this book and the inventor of what we now know of today as the sweet science of boxing, gave a boxing lesson with a famous Nutleyite, Alfred Gear. This guy, Hugh Leonard, writes the wrestling equivalent. So he's the boxing king. This guy, you see, instructor in wrestling at the New York Athletic Club for about 25 years. Again, this was the premier athletic club in the country, and this guy was its wrestling instructor and is famous, nationally famous for that. Comes to Nutley to give a wrestling demonstration. This is Hugh. His book is fascinating because it just shows all of these, as I say, in the era before jiu-jitsu. He gives you, and these look like these great either Etruscan or these Egyptian hieroglyphs, all of these different ways to pin people and bring them down. More than 250 photographs in this book of all of the ways to wrestle. Some of them are just, they're really incredible. And so he is this famous guy. We've got the most famous boxer, the most famous wrestler who've come to town for this event. Not only that, but we've got the other professional, Big Frank, the boxing kangaroo. So there was a boxing kangaroo. While this is not Big Frank himself, this gives you an idea of what would happen in the ring. So we did have a boxing kangaroo here as well. Here I show you the Edward Lloyd field, and he had this troop of trained animals where when I read other descriptions of it, it seems like he came out with stuffed animals and did more of a comedy routine than being an animal trainer. But it was all, as I say, for fun. But down below here, this pony hurdle act by Master Al Sterrett. Al Sterrett is Joe Sterrett's son. He's the third generation horse family guy. And again, the Sterretts were, they said they would not only be bringing your hearses to the funeral parlor, but they would be racing, taking the doctor in to race the stork to somebody's house if you were going to have a baby. They did everything for the town in terms of transportation with their horses. So it's not surprising that this guy practically lived on a horse. And again, he's a 14-year-old by the time this circus is put in. So he does all of his horse tricks, riding, getting up on top of these little pylons with his horse. But he also trains his dog, Simko, as a riding dog. And here is an illustration of Simbu riding it. A little bit more realistically is a photograph of that dog on a rather sturdy looking, probably farm horse. But so this is Alan Sturrett, who is famous, at least in the Nutley Museum and Nutley lore, for another reason. And I've spent the last 10 years looking for a particular item that Anne Troy told me through her writings was in our museum, and I hadn't found it until somebody who came on as a volunteer recently was going through some of our holdings and found this in a box. When you look up, this is the riding jacket worn by that 14-year-old Aaron Sturrett in that Nutley Circus of 1894. So it's this incredible find that we have, the silk jacket that he wore. He's more famous for our holdings because of a coin like this, British coin, that his father threw in the air that night that Annie probably couldn't resist, pulls out her gun, nicks it in the air. Okay, here it is in our museum. He then gives it to his son. This is Joseph, gives it to his son Alan, who was 14 at the time. Alan loves this and holds on to it till he grows up to this Alan Sturrett. You can see the poster here, so he's likely in our museum. And before he dies, he loves showing it off to everybody his whole life. He gives it to the Nutley Historical Society, where you can see it in our museum. It's really one of our loved pieces to have. I show you this here because it says now in the middle, Annie Oakley, America's representative ladies shot. So all of this stuff goes on, all the tumblers come out, the clowns do their acts, all of that stuff. And of course, the highlight in terms of acts is Annie Oakley. Here is Annie. Here is a drawing of Annie that night by a puck artist on the back of a horse. Here she is from that poster that I showed you. Excuse me. Here she is in one of those drawings, but I want to focus more in on this. So this is a photo taken again the day before inside of that riding stable, showing, and this is a photo, this is the only photograph I know of that shows Annie Oakley in Nutley. I don't know of any others. I titled this Little Sure Shot, which is the nickname that Sitting Bull, when he adopted Annie as his daughter, gave to her. So it's Little Sure Shot on Lady Surefoot. This is Molly, the delivery house from the Nichols factory, but she was given that name Lady Surefoot that night because she really performed so well. It was such a good base for all of these people to do her trick on, but the name really works with Little Sure Shot on Lady Surefoot. So I just want to show her here to show you this photograph of what I think, as I say, if anybody has another one, please send it our way, of Annie in Nutley. So she did come out that night and do a trick that she had never done before. She runs and picks up guns and shoots. But this was the first time that she ever, inspired by somebody like Eaton Stone, rode a speeding horse through the circus. So here we go back to this event. You see everyone seated on those benches. You see Annie here. Here's a little bit more of a close-up of her. So this horse is speeding around. People are throwing up. It doesn't sound such like a great thing to sit under, but throwing up glass balls and be covered with shattered pieces of glass that she would continue to shoot as she did her main trick there. Again, a close-up of her on the back of that horse. So that was the trick that Annie unveils that night. And before the event comes to an end, Eaton comes out of retirement and gets on a bareback horse that is running around. And again, he is famous for running inside of a small tent like this. And the first 3 or 4 rows get out of their seats because they can't imagine that horse is not going to careen into them. All the while, he is leaning off the side of a horse, reaching down onto the ground to pick up a hat, finally stands up and does a somersault backwards on a speeding horse. He did some tumbles that night. I don't know exactly what tricks he did, but everybody was quite impressed by that. Henry Bunner comes out and introduces the older performer, and basically says that all of the old circus spirits throughout the country and in this tent are going to come out to pay homage to Eaton Stone, the greatest rider who ever lived. So that's how basically the show ends, with Eaton Stone's performance. All of these people, now remember, people came from Newark, they came from New York City, and they would get on the ferry from New York City to get to either Hoboken or Jersey City. Then they would get on a train to some of them would get off at the stations, where the Sterretts, of course, would pick them up and bring them by horse carriage. A couple of the trains, as I said, would go right to within 50 yards on that little spur because of Eaton's connection with the Erie Railroad, and have people bring them. They came back that evening and brought everybody home at the end of the event. The event was covered in all of the New York newspapers and magazines throughout the country. I want to mention one or two other things. We are getting near the end here. I hope it's not like 6 o'clock at night. It's 3:03. Good. Okay, we're in good shape here. So this illustration I mentioned was by not only of a local event, but by a local artist. And knowing, I had mentioned to you that everybody but the New York press, and apparently that's a time-honored tradition nobody is going to break, was charged to come into this. Bunner was charged to come into this. All of these performers that you've seen, they paid their money to get into it. I haven't read myself out of this one factoid that I came across, so I'm going to go with it. It had mentioned that the only people who had to pay, who didn't pay, were New York Press and Clara Barton. So there's at least a reference to Clara Barton being at this, who of course is the founder of the Red Cross, being at this event as well. But again, it was all charity. All of those people freely gave of their time. Artists would give of their time. So I'm imagining that that Peter Newell did this certainly as pro bono. He is, some of you might know this book. There's also called a whole book back then. They've reissued these today, but with a hole that goes all the way through the book. These are these different, very odd and almost modern, excuse me, books that Newell would have been doing back in the 1890s as a children's book illustrator. Here is his calling card. He is now living in Springfield, Illinois when this is put out. But one illustration that I thought was wonderful of his, the attitude of this young child. What jolly cold weather when you can smoke a slate pencil. So a nice little cartoon by Nutley's own Peter Newell. The other artist that I want to mention, and this is going to get us back to Bunner, but one of the other things that we found in a box buried deep in the basement of the Historical Society about 4 or 5 years ago in many pieces was this Nutley Amateur Circus poster, this incredibly beautiful lithograph that is signed here by the artist. Hutchins is his last name, who turns out to be one of the premier puck artists. So I know, if I say I know for a fact, I mean, it's like there's no other explanation that this would have been something that Hutchins would have done as a favor to Bunner. Remember, in the basement of the Puck building were the largest lithograph machines in the United States. This, I want to show you a detail or two of this and then talk about where this sort of falls in the history of posters and lithography art in a minute. But look at the shape that this is in. I wound up finding this really fantastic artisan or artist in downtown New York who brought this poster back to this state. It's now on a beautiful piece of linen. Some in-painting was done where huge holes were. This was repaired. It seemed like every different era that had a different kind of tape, paper tape, maybe from the 1900s, Scotch tape from another era. So it was in awful shape with holes in it, but it is now restored to all of its glory. It's a beautiful poster. It's now behind great protective glass, hanging in our museum. I just want to point out the artist's name here and to show you a cover of Puck magazine from 1894, that same year, same artist here. So he's getting the cover. And we have in the museum an original piece of Puck art that is also by this same artist. So as I was going through a book that was about the history of posters not that long ago, and what do I find? I find our poster, and it says underneath it, composed and drawn on stone by F.M. Hutchins. Lithography is a printing process that's done by not etching onto a piece of metal, but drawing onto a big piece of stone, lithography stone. 1894 is, of course, when this poster is made. Prior to this poster, or a couple of other ones very close in time, the way that lithography posters were made is that an artist would create the work of art. He would turn it over to a lithographer who would then translate that medium, whether it was oil painting, a sketch, whatever it was that the artist did, into the art of lithography. So there was a transition from one art form to another. You could also say that it was put into the hands of an artisan, a lithography printer, given by an artist. Well, Hutchins, you can see, composed and drawn on stone. So this is one of the first posters where the artist himself was the lithographer. So Hutchins is not just an artist turning over an idea to a lithographer, he's creating this lithograph as a work of lithography art. And it's being printed as such. And I just want to show you it again. And just what a beautiful piece. And we're so lucky to have this. It is unique. I can only imagine that a couple of these were turned out to hang around town. By the way, I've read references that nearly every porch in Nutley was strung with little triangular flags with red crosses on them. The whole town, which is what the name of this inspired the name of this talk, the circus that inspired a town. Everybody got into it. So I just want to go back to our three main individuals we talked about today: Bunner, Eaton Stone, and Annie Oakley. And just two little things here about Bunner, as he, I think, liked to be perceived as the poet, as the author, as the New York effete. Here he is as well. One of the things that the New York press absolutely loved about this event was that it produced this Henry Bunner. It produced a Henry Bunner who might have had a drink or two, who is doing tricks on the back of a horse. Something that the New York press never thought they'd see and were really thrilled. But this photograph, I think, really sums up what this event was all about. It was all about people from wildly different professions and backgrounds coming together. And by the way, it is called the Nutley Amateur Circus, even though we were Franklin at the time, because it was this artistic group from the Nutley kind of neighborhood that did it. But they even said that it turned into a sort of Nutley circus when it got the bigger idea that it would be for the Red Cross. Of course, that they put in all of their writings was something that was being done for Franklin Township. So just beautiful event, done, as some people said, first and foremost for fun and then for charity, but I think both were hand in hand. The last two images of the event, I want to show you this, which is at the end of that gold book that I showed you. The last page is good night. This is the end of the program. Again, Day is a puck artist, and if you remember the puck himself, who was standing there with the hand mirror to cast an image of what we are, and then to reflect that in the writing with the pen that he held. She seems to be walking a tightrope, but if you look at it, it also looks like a fountain pen. So I think, again, another way that the puck artist was putting himself into this. Just a beautiful image, I think, to end this Red Cross event. I want to mention, I showed you this photograph earlier. This is Dave, who is, as Annie was fond of saying, an English setter, but an American dog. And she really loved the fact that he was such a friendly animal, and she loved him so much, the two of them. Here she is after having just fired a shot which blew an apple off of Dave's head while he sat on this bench. And here is Frank, her husband, who's getting Dave. Dave is now able to leap down and come off of here. But Dave would sit there and trust his Annie enough that she would shoot things off of his head. The reason, though, I mentioned Dave in this talk is because Dave here, and here he is with Annie, becomes the Red Cross dog. Here you see Annie here. So Annie's connection with the Red Cross lived with her for many, many, many decades after this circus performance. Dave would, at all these Red Cross events where Annie was probably teaching people and most often women how to shoot, people would take money to donate to the Red Cross, let Dave go all around the crowd and sniff their money. Then they would hide it in their wallet, in their back pockets, whatever. Dave would go around the crowds and sniff out all of the money, which became donations to the Red Cross. By the way, the Red Cross event that I mentioned to you took in about just under $1,000, about $900, which converts to about $30,000 in today's money. And again, that was to buy simple things like medicine and splints and plaster and bed sheets, but also to have an endowment at St. Barnabas Hospital in Newark in case a Nutleyite, and the beautiful little phrase, or a stranger within our gates needed any of those supplies. So that is Dave. A number of you have seen this next item. I'm going to end with this, but the circus not only inspired the town back in 1894, it inspired me to come up with the idea. Some of you who might have attended the last talk that I gave, which was about Nutley muralists, know that the Nutley Historical Society not only cleaned 5 85-year-old murals in the middle school, but filled the final empty niche with a mural. We were inspired to say that that mural should honor this charitable event. And so the Nutley Amateur Circus was the concept put out to middle and high school students. 17 kids took up the challenge, and painted half-size maquettes. So the final piece is 6 feet wide. They did 3-foot watercolor or gouache ones. I'm only going to show you 2 or 3 of them, and the ones that, of course, feature Henry Bunner, Eaton Stone, Annie Oakley here, as well as our Red Cross. You could see the tumbler there, inspired by the event. Here is another one which I thought was really beautiful. The 2 details I want to show you here is Frank, our boxing kangaroo, but also Annie Oakley enjoying her ride on the back of this horse. This one here, again, which shows, I presume, Eaton here, but also Henry and Annie. And then the piece that won. So here is the maquette by the artist, and this will give you an idea of 3 feet wide, 6 feet wide, and then the finished piece, which has a couple of months ago been installed in the Nutley, in the John Walker Middle School. When I gave this talk a month or 2 ago about the murals, one of the questions I got back was, do you have a picture of the artist for this? David Desari is his name. And here is, it's not the greatest quality picture, but here is David next to his piece of art. This is a night about 2 years ago that we unveiled the winner, the night that we actually unveiled all of the murals that were restored. So this is David and his work of art, which now resides in the final niche in the middle school. And unlike the canvas ones that are there now, should we ever have to, we can take, I think, 5 bolts and simply take this piece of masonite board out. So that is the Nutley Amateur Circus. I end it with, again, one of my famous slides here. And I'm happy to answer anyone's questions about anything we've covered. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, John. Really, I very much enjoyed the presentation, and it's amazing how much money they were able to bring in. With it was, you said it was over $1,000 back then. Yeah,
so just close to $1,000, which again I get is about 30 today.
Yeah, and it was all held on where the Hoffman La Roche is now. correct?
Right, so where
I
OX
mean,
3 is,
on 3.
yeah. So if you're coming along Kingsland Road at that point and you get to the main entrance, that you would be making a right if Roche Properties on your right,
Yeah.
you've gone a little bit too far, maybe about a football field or two closer to Franklin Avenue.
Mhm.
Is that building that I showed that looks like a sort of a modern chapel
Yes.
almost, it's an A-frame building. And my understanding is that that is where the Eaton Stone house was, and then you saw from the maps that within 100 feet or so of that was where the Circus Pavilion was.
I was impressed to learn about Eaton Stone and like how he was able to do all these different aerobatics and I mean really he really took he really took the idea to heart. Like he wanted to be part of the circus.
He absolutely did. And again,
Yeah,
I love that he got so rich because he would never invest in the circus.
yeah,
But he certainly made his life out of it. And as I say, made his life from age 10. And
yeah,
long enough to know, at least long enough ago, that he has still got, he can have these stories about being kidnapped by Comanches and being sort of held captive for a couple of years, but learning all of his riding skills with that. And again, he's called the Devil Rider, mostly because he would be riding at what people
yeah,
called a breakneck and a fearful speed.
yeah,
So yeah, he was the surprise to me. I knew a lot about Bunner and I knew a lot about Annie going into this, and I just
yeah.
figured, okay, this retired circus guy. But when you read about him in any of the histories of circuses, he's a
Mhm.
big name that pops up all the way through.
Was there ever another circus that was held in Nutley, or was this the only one?
I'm sure that there were others. I've
Yeah.
seen a couple of references to the Republican Club holding a circus
Mhm.
in the Winter Pavilion, which I think would have been Stone's Pavilion, but none of those. I think this has the history that I could find because of Bunner and because of Annie. So I haven't really read any other real firsthand accounts of
Mhm.
other circuses. I'm sure that they were. This was the big one, and this was the one that at least lives through to today with history that you could still find.
And with Bunner too, like all the publicity he was able to get for this too, with the New York press, um, people discovering our town through the New York press too, is really such an event that happened.
Yeah, and Nutley sort of Bunner sings Nutley's praises that way a lot, but also very subtly. So when I had mentioned Jersey Street and Jersey Lane, and also the Suburban Sage,
Mhm.
those of us who live in Nutley can read through them and know a lot of what he's talking about, where he's talking about.
Yes.
In a book like one of his earliest books, that's called The Story of a New York House,
Mhm.
and it takes place all in Lower Manhattan, which is all that would have existed back in the very early 1800s. But there's a scene of him, of the character, who's walking past City Hall. And City Hall is being built in 1812, so that is able to, we kind of know the year that this story is taking place. And he looks over at City Hall being built, and he goes out of his way to comment on the marble front, but also on the piles of brownstone that are going to be used to complete that building.
Yeah.
Now, we know that he's talking about Nutley brownstone, which is what the three ends of New York City Hall were built out of until about the 1950s when they were covered over. So even things like that nobody else would know. The only reason that Bunner character even notices those brownstones and mentions them is sort of a very subtle shout out to that Nutley industry.
And he was just recently inducted into the Nutley Hall of Fame. Um, so we can learn more about him on the library's website. There's a Nutley Hall of Fame page, and there's a nice biography
Exactly.
about
Yeah.
about Bunner.
Yep.
Uh, well, I think this is a good stopping point here. We got a lot of great positive feedback with
Good.
the responses, and I'll share them with you, John. But thank you, everyone, for attending. John, thank you for all the work you put into this presentation. It was excellent.
You're very welcome, and no pressure, but one of the things I wanted to mention was when I had mentioned that this was the Nutley Amateur Circus, and Nutley, even though it was held in Franklin, there's a talk that I would love to give sometime when you find a slot, that is called something along the lines of "And Then There Was One." And it's a story about Avondale sort of community. and along the Passaic River and the quarries and St. Mary's Church and all of that stuff. Then Nutley, which is the more artistic part, and Highfield Lane and Grant Avenue and enclosure and all of that. And then Franklinville, which is the industrial part around the mills, the Stitz and the Duncan Mills, and right around where our oval is. That was sort of the business center, and how those three different villages came together to become the Franklin or the Nutley that we know today.
Yeah, sounds like a great. I'm definitely interested in having that here, and we have a good series here. So I'd love to continue it with this. And then there were, and then there was one. I think that'd be a great discussion that we could definitely talk about and plan for in the near future.
Good. I'm glad you like that. And everybody, thanks for listening today.
Thank you, everyone, and everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Take care.
Bye-bye.